Order!
Oh, Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all of us command. Quatre bras s'est porté l'épée, il s'est porté la croix. Dans l'histoire, tu les pompées, tes plumes brillants exploits. God keep our land glorious and free. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
O God, may your spirit and guidance be with us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspiration of those who we serve. Amen.
Must see Olivia Rockwell. That was ever a beautiful voice. Olivia is serving as a page in this assembly, and we thank her and all the other pages for the hard work. Colleagues, today marks the 53rd anniversary of the National Flag Canada. It was on February 15, 1965, that our Canadian flag first flew above our nation's capital. Our national flag has flown with pride since that day. In 1996, February 15th, was declared National Flag of Canada Day to commemorate and celebrate what has become one of the most iconic and recognizable flags across the world. Not only is our flag recognized the world over as a symbol of a great country, but it is associated with the rights, freedom, and ideals that we embrace as Canadians. In 2018, the National Flag of Canada is celebrating its 53rd anniversary during the 2018 Winter Olympics. This important symbol of our identity will be flown cheering on our Canadian Olympics and the Paralympics athletes. Members, join me in celebration of National Flag of Canada Day. Thank you, colleagues. Minister statements. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Mr. Speaker, it is critical to ensure that the Northern post-secondary education system meets the changing needs of our students and the demands of the Northwest Territories labour market. The Department of Education, Culture, and Employment's long-term labour market assessment tells us that 78% of Northwest Territories jobs in the next 15 years will require a post-secondary education. This government has an ambitious agenda that will help us establish a modern post-secondary education system to support our residents' academic and employment success. Mr. Speaker, the Department is examining all aspects of post-secondary education in the Northwest Territories. We need to make strategic decisions that will result in more graduates working and leading productive lives in the Northwest Territories. Our first step was to conduct a labour market review through the Skills for Success initiative, completed in April of 2016. This information is the ground for our next steps in making sure post-secondary education and training programs support Northwest Territories labour market demand and that they help to close the gap between residents' education level and labor market needs. The next step in meeting our commitments is the completion of the Aurora College Foundational Review. I updated members on the progress of the review earlier in this sitting. The review will be a tool to help establish a renewed foundation for the college and will help inform its long-term strategic plan. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we committed in the mandate to develop new legislation that will outline a quality assurance system on the basis of which post-secondary institution will be recognized or authorized in the Northwest Territories. We envision a new legislative framework that will govern all post-secondary education in the Northwest Territories. The primary objective of this framework is to create a process of recognition for post-secondary institutions that ensures they are effectively governed and that they have appropriate quality assurance measures in place, and that their programs are in alignment with national and international standards and best practices. This legislation will give students the confidence that the post-secondary institution they attend is recognized or registered by the government of the Northwest Territories and that it has met the standards for its designation. Mr. Speaker, the proposed new legislation will create transparency and clarity for new post-secondary institutions in the Northwest Territories. It will also create opportunities for existing qualified institutions to obtain degree-granting status. However, it will not replace the Aurora College Act. The legislative process will include engagement with all key stakeholders. The framework will be a collaborative effort reflecting the unique cultural, social, economic, and geographic context in the Northwest Territories today. Mr. Speaker, the development of a skilled workforce is a pillar of the Government of the Northwest Territories' vision for a strong territorial economy. By making system-wide foundational improvements to the adult and post-secondary education and skills training system, these initiatives will foster sound, modern, and sustainable post-secondary institutions and programs for the Northwest Territories and a thriving Northwest Territories workforce. Our proposed post-secondary legislation, the Aurora College Foundational Review, and the new Aurora College Strategic Plan are all significant pieces of work, but they do not stand alone. They are aligned with the Department of Education, Culture and Employment's comprehensive frameworks, including education renewal and skills for success, and with strategies like the apprenticeship, trades and occupational certification, immigration, and soon the small communities employment. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Education, Culture and Employment has been working hard to carry out our agenda for post-secondary education and make a better future for our residents. These three major pieces of work, along with the work of other departments, governments, stakeholders, and this House, are coming together to create a stronger social, economic, and educational foundation for the North. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister statement. Minister, you can go down in the Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, the Mackenzie River is a marine highway to the Arctic Ocean, a reliable shipping route for generations. The Mackenzie River is the northernmost link to an intermodal supply chain that stretches from the Gulf of Mexico to the Beaufort Sea and beyond. 2017 marked the year that the Government of the Northwest Territories assumed responsibility for scheduled tug and barge services to our communities on Great Slave Lake, the Mackenzie River, and the Arctic coast. In 2017, the Government of the Northwest Territories Marine Transportation Services Division registered and reactivated 6 tugboats, transported more than 37 million liters of fuel, and carried more than 10,000 tons of deck cargo to communities and commercial clients. Other key accomplishments include maintenance work on the Canadian Coast Guard vessels and substantial charter work for large industrial clients. The cost-effective and effective delivery of such services to N.W.T businesses is one example of how the Government of the Northwest Territories is fulfilling its mandate to strengthen connections with private sector partners in transportation infrastructure. At the peak of last season, Marine Transportation Services employed over 140 people. 60 of those were from the Northwest Territories. Last season, Marine Transportation Services issued almost $3 million in contracts to Northwest Territories businesses and created many indirect spin-offs for local businesses. Continued investment in our supporting marine infrastructure, including Canada's northernmost inland shipyard, will allow us to take advantage of such opportunities. The Government of the Northwest Territories continues to pursue opportunities for funding that may be available through initiatives such as the Federal Ocean Protection Plan. As we prepare for the 2018 sailing season, we begin from a much better operational situation than we did from our first season. Experience from the 2017 sailing season is informing improvement strategies and work to determine an appropriate business model for the long term continues. Commercial, industrial, and tourism activity in the Arctic is increasing, along with the economic development opportunities that go with it. To support this anticipated growth, we are pleased with the recent announcement by Transport Canada that they will provide funding to the N.W.T Fisheries and Marine Training Consortium to establish a marine training centre in the Northwest Territories. The establishment of the Centre for Marine-related Training is a strategic investment that supports the government's priority to develop a skilled northern workforce. Mr. Speaker, our priority remains that essential goods will be delivered without fail and at a reasonable cost to residents who rely on marine transportation services. We are committed to building a new business relationships, training our people, creating jobs, and stimulating the economy in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statement. Member for Hay River North.
Mr. Speaker, our Premier has stated that the dreams of Northerners are dying. If that's the case, then to many residents, the answers this House received yesterday on questions of government procurement must have sounded like hammer strikes, each one driving yet another nail deeper into the coffin of those dreams. Despite the fact that 4 members of this House, all members of the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment, raised concerns about government procurement, the Minister of Infrastructure denied the existence of any problems. This stance is based in part on his claim that only 2 or 3 people have contacted him personally. Mr. Speaker, as MLAs, we're the people's conduits to the government. To me, if an MLA brings an issue to a minister, that's the same as the constituent speaking directly to the minister. That's Democracy 101. The minister also cited the number of complaints received through the department's vendor complaint process as proof that there's no issues. 22 complaints since 2010 and only 2 deemed valid. Mr. Speaker, that process is designed to ensure that the very practices we're criticizing are followed. It's not designed to address the systemic issues that we're concerned with. A complaint can only be made about a specific RFP by someone who bid on that RFP, and the department can dismiss the claim without consideration. However, there was a glimmer of hope during question period. Over the pounding of the nails, the Premier heard the dreams of Northerners clawing at the lid of the coffin. He was open to listening to the concerns of MLAs and admitted that it's in the realm of possibility that procurement practices may not be perfect. This harkened back to 2015, when then MLA MacLeod, in his bid for the office of the Premier, stated that the government of the Northwest Territories needs to look at its own procurement and contracting policies. There's hope after all, Mr. Speaker. It's good to hear that the Premier is open to change, because infrastructure isn't the only department or government entity involved in procurement. The Housing Corporation does its own procurement, and it's actually made some of the changes that we're asking for to the benefit of Northerners. Finance is also involved in procurement by housing the N.W.T's procurement policy, negotiating P3s, and setting sole source procurement thresholds. Today I'll have questions to the Minister of Finance about those thresholds and how he's ensuring they're not doing a disservice to Northerners. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ika Goodan and the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the last government made a commitment to increase territorial population by 2,000 new residents by 2020. While we are still far from this target, in our mandate, this government restated the commitment to increase the number of immigrants settling here. Immigration is good. It brings diversity, innovation, optimism, and fresh perspectives to our territory while increasing our tax base, investments, and territorial financing formula. It makes sense that we split the nominee program into 2 streams, one administered by Education, Culture and Employment, and the other by Industry, Tourism and Investment. ECE stream is connected to employers seeking skilled workers, while ITI stream focuses on new investment in the form of business development. ECE's employer stream is seeing some success. In 2015, we welcomed about 103 new residents and 125 in 2016. That meets the department's goal of increasing immigration by 25%. At this pace, we will bring in 823 new residents by 2019. ITI's business stream has been much less successful. Between 2015 and 2017, we had only 3 applications totaling 10 new immigrants. I would like to know if ITI has identified the reasons for the lack of success of the business stream and what it plans to do to address it. Mr. Speaker, it is important to know how other jurisdictions attract foreign nationals. After all, they are our competition. As an example, British Columbia requires potential new residents to invest $200,000 in a new or purchased business. The N.W.T requires $300,000 if located in Yellowknife. One can imagine that new Canadians might rather invest less and enjoy a milder climate and more amenities and opportunities. Mr. Speaker, we Northerners know we live in the best place in the world, but it's not always easy to attract Southern Canadians to the N.W.T, let alone people from the rest of the world. I commend the government on its success inviting immigration, but the N.W.T needs skills, dedication, new ideas, and energy, not to mention we need the investment new residents will bring. We need to improve our immigration process to attract bright, creative, energetic, new residents to contribute to our growing community of Northerners. Mr. Speaker, at the appropriate time, I'll have questions for the Minister of ITI. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Goodani, the member Satu.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Our N.W.T elders deserve the utmost respect and expect their government supports on elders' subsidy programs. Their well-earned financial securities is designed to support their retirement. The government of Northwest Territories offers a variety of security benefits to the elders community. It is comforting to know that both federal and territorial levels of government are there to assist. Mr. Speaker, offering eligibility and screening the applications is and can be questionable. Like many other policies offered by the government, reviews on efficiencies can be entertained. Elders' retirement security is a personal choice and achievement. Disclosure of financial information is a possession that only the elder can decide on releasing. The Department of Culture, Education, Culture and Employment fuel subsidy program is complementary. However, disclosure of financial security and information in fulfilling the policy is, as mentioned earlier, questionable. Mr. Speaker, later I will have questions to the Minister of ECE. Merci.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Goodani, the member Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the past week, Indigenous activists across Canada have raised their voices in frustration and anger over the ongoing effects of colonization in our country. And they have reinforced the clear message that there can be no peace or harmony unless there is justice. We must all admit, as a society, that successive governments have tried, sometimes intentionally, sometimes in ignorance, to absorb Indigenous peoples into Canadian society, thus eliminating them as distinct peoples. Policies pursued over the decades have undermined and almost erased Indigenous cultures, identities, and languages. This was profoundly wrong, and it must be addressed by every government in Canada. To bring about this fundamental change, Canadians need to understand that Indigenous people are nations, and we must have a nation-to-nation relationship. That is why today I acknowledge the efforts of the Prime Minister of Canada and his intention to give new life to Section 35 of the Constitution Act, which recognizes and affirms Indigenous peoples' rights and treaty rights. Instead of outright recognizing and affirming Indigenous rights, as we promised we would, Indigenous peoples were forced to prove time and time again, through costly and drawn-out court challenges, that their rights existed, must be recognized and implemented. A rethink of Indigenous rights will allow Indigenous peoples to pursue greater self-determination with the ultimate goal of addressing entrenched economic and social problems in Indigenous communities. To that end, the federal government has said it will develop a new recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights framework through consultation with Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. And this will result in legislation that will be introduced later this year with full implementation ahead of the next election, October 2019. I am pleased again to see the federal government supporting this important initiative and bringing us closer to reconciliation. Events like the tragic circumstances surrounding the Colton Bushey remind us that there is still so much work to be done in our society, and to always listen to Indigenous people who, when they raise their voices around perceived injustice and real injustice that we see throughout our society. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike-Goodman and the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. On December 22nd of last year, the Mackenzie Gas Project partners announced their decision not to proceed with the development. Not only is there no interest in offshore hydrocarbon, onshore interest has evaporated. As the Premier predicted, there is no interest in N.W.T oil and gas, and it will not come back for a long time, if ever. Some government leaders are blaming the review processes for demise of the project. Nothing could be further from the truth. Had the project gone ahead, it would now be a multi-billion-dollar white elephant. This project never had any confirmed shippers beyond the anchor fields, but applied for a pipeline to handle much more. The environmental impact statement was submitted by the developers less than 2 months after it was requested. 6 rounds of information requests took up precious time and resources. This points to a poor job by the developers. In total, the developers requested delays or extensions 30 times during the joint review process. These delays and extensions total 500 days, although some of these happened concurrently. The job of the Review Board and the National Energy Board was made much more difficult because the federal and territorial governments limited the participation of employees to provide their expertise and knowledge, a process now formalized in this Cabinet's project assessment policy. Non-governmental organizations were often put in the position of providing expert evidence and doing the job of governments, despite being not resourced at all in some cases. What lessons can we learn from the Mackenzie Gas Project? Here's a few, Mr. Speaker. Pinning all your hopes on one or a few large projects is not sound economic development planning. You can try to rush projects through, but this will come back to bite you in the end. And while using hydrocarbon resources locally may make some sense, investing more time and effort into oil and gas development in the Northwest Territories is not a wise use of our efforts. It's not clear whether our Cabinet has learned much from the Mackenzie Gas Project, and I will have questions later today for the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike-Goodman and the member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've been asked for the past 2 years about connecting the residents of Fort Liard and Fort Nelson Hospital. The last minister's tour, as I was told by a number of residents, this has been an issue for the past 25 years. You heard me correct, Mr. Speaker, 25 years. Today, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to share with you words from some elders who would like to see this issue resolved once and for all. Mr. Speaker, most of the people of Fort Liard prefer to go to Fort Nelson for medical appointments and access the hospital services. It is a 2.5-hour drive to Fort Nelson compared to a 3.5-hour drive to Fort Simpson, then a 2-hour plane ride to Yellowknife, then a short drive to the hospital for an appointment, then a long wait for the return flight, and then another long ride home. Some of the issues they have experienced: no interpreters available, drivers dropping them off without support or direction for their appointments. Some of their plane rides were very scary and they felt very stressed. There has been numerous flight delays in which appointments are cancelled or need to be rearranged. And I feel it would be more cost efficient and less stressful for the people to go to Fort Nelson. Some patients with little English or no English are sent home without an idea of what is wrong with them, what aftercare plan is about, or what to do next. Mr. Speaker, I've stated before, the elders prefer to travel to Fort Nelson. They would like the fact that they have friends and families close by. There are places to rent and stay that are less costly for family members. Mr. Speaker, as elders state, our life and health is important. Unfortunately, we have lost too many of our loved ones to health issues, and it seems that the N.W.T doesn't seem to care. They tell me, we do live in Canada. BC and N.W.T are in Canada. We are status, and we should be treated as such to be covered in Canada. They want to help have the proper medical care in place, which means using the closest hospital to them. As well, they would like to have access to more denny treatments. Presently, medical travel only seems to cover travel in the Northwest Territories. Mr. Speaker, I'll have questions for the Health and Social Minister later on. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike, go down in the Member Yellowknife Centre.
Massey, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I had the pleasure today to go to a unique event hosted by Ecole St. Patrick High School called St. Pat Serves. The intent of the day was to engage students in a variety of work done by organizations that fight for social justice and provide various volunteer services and opportunities here in Yellowknife. A total of 24 organizations participated, including nonprofits like Food Rescue and the Tree of Peace, volunteer organizations like the Rotary Club and Alternatives North, as well as faith-based organizations. It was a very impressive list. Each group had up to half an hour to talk about their work and to answer questions. Students chose which sessions to attend and had the opportunity to ask questions. Throughout the lunch hour, the organizations participated in a fair set up in the gym where students could chat with groups about presentations that they didn't get to. Mr. Speaker, this afternoon students will hear from Alvin Law, a highly motivating speaker. He was born without arms because his mother used the drug thalidomide while she was pregnant. Mr. Law learned to use his feet to accomplish daily tasks, including driving. He's also a great musical talent who plays the drums with his feet. His story is truly inspiring. I was impressed with how many students at St. Patrick's School already volunteer as coaches and mentors, and in schools and in nonprofits. I was also impressed with the number who want to do more. Hats off to the organizers of this uplifting day. Mr. Speaker, I was there to talk about a day of services I organize for people with low or no income. Yes, We Care Day is held twice a year. The main draw is the opportunity to have a professional haircut free of charge from Yellowknife hairdressers and a barber who volunteer their time. The greatest reward is seeing people downtown the next day, looking good and walking tall. Students from St. Pat's have always volunteered at this event to serve food, wash dishes, and sweep up hair. Mr. Speaker, these students are our future. I am confident they will continue the tradition of caring and sharing in Yellowknife. We are in good hands. Massey.
Massey. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Inuvik, Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize my wife of 38 years, Judy, who's up in the gallery, also a constituent of Inuvik Boot Lake. And I'd also like to use this opportunity to recognize two of the pages we have in here from Inuvik. We got Keely Vudrak and we have Brianna Lenny. I'd like to thank them and all the other pages for the work they do on our behalf. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize Olivia Rockwell, who did an amazing job on the rendition of O Canada earlier today. She is a resident of Yellowknife North, and I also want to thank the pages for all the work that they do for us here in the Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too rise to recognize 2 pages today from my constituency of Cam Lake, Noah Zoe and Stella Simslow. It's great to have you in the House helping us out this week, and I really appreciate it, and I appreciate all the work of the pages as well. Thank you.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral question. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Early in the life of this Assembly, the Department of Finance raised the sole source procurement threshold for goods and services to $10,000 and $25,000 respectively. This means that those N.W.T employees with the appropriate purchasing authority can purchase an item worth less than $10,000 without going to RFP, and there's no reporting on that spending. I've had some constituents who support this increase, but I've also had some who are very concerned with it. And this has been raised in the House numerous times by multiple MLAs. So my first question is that it was my understanding that the increased thresholds were going to be reviewed by the end of this fiscal year. If that review has been completed, I'd like the Minister to share those findings with the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, members correct. We did raise the limits. It has been well received by a lot of business across the N.W.T. Of course, there's always concerns with a lot of the initiatives that we take on. I have committed the Department of Finance to review the impact of the increase. We're just the Procurement Committee are just developing the terms of reference and are looking at getting an independent contractor to review the policy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Akita Cassie, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a feeling the Procurement Committee might hate me by the end of this Assembly. Has the increase... So I'm going to switch around my questions here. I'm going to jump to the third one I provided to the Minister. So the increase has resulted in many government purchases not going to RFP, which means that small businesses, not only do they not have a chance to bid on these, they don't even know these are going out. So purchases might be made based on friendships. You know, the person in the government might know his buddy might own a store, and that's where they get these purchases from. And when you're looking at $10,000 per item, that can add up. So will the Minister commit to looking at what impact these increased thresholds have had on small businesses? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, first of all, we'd like to think that the folks that are working for the GNWT, first of all, will look at getting value for money in the products. And if there are situations such as the member described, then I would not approve of that, and I would have to get to the bottom of it and do an investigation into using friends and as such. But going back to the member's question, that could be one of the parts of the review is to have a look at how it's impacted smaller businesses. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Cassie, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you mentioned value for money, and that's the other thing I'm concerned about. The public isn't aware of these purchases. We don't know what's going on, and that's the public often is the one pointing out if we're not getting good value for money. You know, there's a lot of people out there who pay attention to what we do. And so how is I suppose since they're still determining the terms of reference, how is this committee going to ensure that we are getting value for money? What's the plan going forward? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
As part of the review and in my conversation that I will have with the department, I want to ensure that the government gets value for money. If it means a different type of reporting and that, then it's something that I would commit to having a discussion with my officials about, because at the end of the day, I want to ensure that the government gets value for money, and there's also opportunities for a lot of smaller businesses to take advantage of some of the sole source contracts that we have out. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundere Cassie, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this, I mentioned yesterday that I had over half a dozen business owners and representatives in my office discussing procurement, and this was one of the major themes that we discussed. So I'm going to sit down with the Minister and bring up some of those specific examples so I can show him what I mean about value for money. And so I guess I'd like to know, when can we expect this report to be, or this review to be completed and presented to the House? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to having the conversation with the member because we're always interested in some of the concerns that are raised across Northwest Territories, not only on this particular issue, but other issues. So I look forward to having that conversation. I will commit that I will follow up on any discussions that we may have. As far as the timeline, as I said before, we're developing the terms of references, and as I become aware of the timeline to when we actually get this out, I will keep the member in this House informed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, County, the member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to follow up on my member statement today to the Minister of Health and Social Services. As I stated previously, the issue of trying to get patients referred to from Fort Nelson to, or from Fort Liard to Fort Nelson to deal with the medical conditions has been a concern, and it's been going on for 25 years. And I was really shocked when I heard that, and I've talked to the minister about it, and I realize he's only been in this portfolio for 4 years, I believe it is. So I feel sorry for him, but can the Minister of Health and Social Services please provide the status of the agreement with the PC government to allow residents from Fort Liard and Nahanni-Butte to be deferred to the Fort Nelson Hospital? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this issue first came to my attention about 3.5 years ago when I traveled to the communities of Fort Liard and Nahanni-Butte with the former MLA from the Nahende riding. At that time, I indicated that we would certainly be willing to have a discussion with Fort Nelson and the government of British Columbia to put in place some protocols that would allow us to refer our residents from Fort Liard to Fort Nelson. At that time, I did say we would wait until we finished our negotiations with the Alberta government that we're currently updating our protocols on. Unfortunately, that has taken far longer than I had hoped. And in last fall, I had a discussion with the department, got an update on both files, and at that time, I did direct the Department of Health and Social Services to work with the government of BC and in particular Fort Nelson to establish some protocols that would allow us to refer residents of both Fort Liard and Nahanni-Butte to Fort Norman in British Columbia, which, as the member said, is a 2-hour drive away instead of a 3-hour drive away, and then a 2-hour flight away, and then an overnight stay, and then a return. We're interested in providing best health and best care to our residents, and I think this is an important protocol that we have to put in place. The department has done some initial research and analysis, and they will be traveling into Fort Nelson later in March. And hopefully at that time they'll also be meeting with leadership in the community to try to determine the best ways to move forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, County, member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for giving us this update, and I appreciate the hard work him and his department is doing. Again, you can understand the confusion and the willingness or unwillingness the community is saying. It's been 25 years, and I appreciate the work he's doing right now, and the department is. Can the Minister please tell us what challenges are stopping this agreement from being completed? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are a couple things. And first off, I want to say, as Canadian citizens, all residents of the Northwest Territories can go anywhere they want to receive acute care and primary care services. So residents of Liard can go to Fort Nelson now, and those services will be covered. It's the referrals that I think is the problem. Right now, if we make a referral, they refer into our system, which means often they'll end up in Yellowknife or Edmonton, which is, I think, the main issue that's being raised. One of the challenges we have is engaging the level of interest in Fort Nelson and BC to actually open up more of their services than they currently do. And right now, a large number of our residents from Fort Liard do go to Nelson, but there is no formal protocols. So we need to determine what level of support or what level of services they want to make available. We need to understand the costs of providing medical travel there as opposed to other things. There might be an opportunity for controlling some spending, which is good. And we also need to make sure what types of services are available in Liard so that people are receiving services in Liard when they're there and are being referred out appropriately. So there are some challenges, some details we have to work up, but we're committed to getting that work done. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, County, member Nahende.
Thank you. And I thank the minister for the answer. In my conversations with some of the residents, and they were concerned about exchanging of medical information between BC and the hospital there in Fort Liard. So I guess my question to the minister in regards to that, has this been one of the challenges that we see, and how are you able to resolve this issue? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, privacy rights of our patients is certainly an issue. And a number of years ago, we came up with more new health privacy legislation here in the Northwest Territories. Having that legislation actually, I think, will help us in this particular situation because we know what the expectations are, as opposed to when all privacy was under the access to information and privacy. So I think we're actually in a better place to have a more informed discussion on this, but it is absolutely a factor. I mean, the rights of all patients to have privacy and their information not ending up where it shouldn't be is paramount, and we need to make sure that that is addressed and taken care of in all of our discussions. And if we're going to open up to having referrals to a jurisdiction that we don't currently have a relationship, we need to make sure that that relationship is solid, that there's protocols in place to make sure that our residents' privacy is protected, while at the same time providing high-quality health services to all residents. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. Nundere Kasi member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the minister's answer. It did help clarify a number of issues from what I've heard, and I think the minister has heard those same concerns previously. When will the residents of Fort Liard and Nahanni finally see an agreement in place so that they can be sent to Fort Nelson for their medical treatment in the future? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I've indicated, I've already provided direction to the department to move forward on this initiative and to engage BC. But this is a negotiation between the Northwest Territories and the government of BC, and I'm cautious about setting a finite date because there is a third party here. There is the government of BC that will have certain expectations, criteria they want meet, and this may not be as big a priority for them as it is for us. But we'll have a better sense, I think, towards the end of March on what kind of timelines, what kind of workload this is going to take. And when I know, I'll certainly let the member know, and he'll be able to share that information with his community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. The member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my member statement, I talked about the federal government's new plan announced by the Prime Minister to follow some of the recommendations of the Royal Commission to implement a new Indigenous rights framework. And some of this stems from the Royal Commission on Indigenous Peoples, which dates back to the 1990s. In particular, its call for the federal government to help foster autonomy by moving communities away from restrictions of colonial-era Indian Act, which impacts Southern Canada, but it also has impacts on self-government. I'd like to ask the Premier if this government has a position on the newly announced legislative framework for Indigenous rights in Canada. Thank you.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government supports any initiatives that will enhance the situation of Aboriginal peoples and also reinforce their Aboriginal rights and treaties. And certainly I'll be consulting with the Aboriginal governments to see if they are in full support of the announcement by the Prime Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. Kasi member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, undoing 150 years of colonization, will not be easy. It'll be a complicated process. So is the Premier prepared to support these efforts at the territorial level and give our Indigenous nations the opportunity to participate in any processes as it relates to consultation with the federal government on this framework? Thank you.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we've had this discussion before. We will certainly work with our Aboriginal government partners, and if they are support, we will fully support the initiative as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. Kasi. Oral question. The member Satu.
Mr. Speaker. In my member statement, I was making reference to questions to the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. My first question, Mr. Minister, is, or Mr. Speaker, is can the Minister explain what subsidy programs are available to the N.W.T. elders community? Massey.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can only really speak to my department, where we do have the senior home heating subsidy, as well as September of last year we did do an increase to the senior citizen supplementary benefit. I know housing has some programs. Health and social services have some programs. I mean, all departments can work together to get that information. We also do work very closely with the N.W.T. Senior Society, Yellowknife Senior Society. They have a really great handbook in terms of the programs and services that are provided to seniors. So I'd encourage the member to also contact them to get that information for his constituents, and any member to get that information to share with their seniors in their respective hometowns. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. All question the Kittiwake Council member South 2.
Massey, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to hear that there's a wide variety of programs available to our elders. Can the Minister explain the elders' fuel subsidy program in general detail? For example, does the rate subsidy differ from smaller communities to regional communities? Massey.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member is correct. Depending on the household income and the community which you live in, depends on the amount of subsidy in terms of home heating that you will get. Seniors are eligible. This is for all members and all residents in N.W.T. that seniors are eligible to receive a set amount of wood, oil, propane, gas, and/or electricity. And as I mentioned, it is dependent on the household income and the community in which they live in. Our client service officers do a good job of informing our seniors and residents of what they're capable of accessing, and encourage any seniors that have any questions on this to go in and see one of our employees. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. All question Kittiwake Council member South 2.
Massey, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister work with me to draft some information for a couple of clients that have brought to my attention the disclosure of their personal information, and they found it difficult as to why the department is asking for their personal retirement savings that they've earned prior to retirement? So will the Minister work with me or to get information to the appropriate clients? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, I'll work with the member, and if he can provide us with the names and information of any constituents that are having any concerns with accessing the senior home heating subsidy. As I mentioned, there are different indicators of being able to be eligible to receive the senior home heating subsidy, and I will work with the member and ask him to provide us with the names of his constituents. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. All question Kittiwake Council member South 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my last question prior to the long weekend is, will the Minister, along with the Minister responsible for seniors and the Minister responsible for HSS, taking the Minister Moses' lead on our request to coordinate a seniors gathering in preparation for the opening of the Sato Regional Health Center coming later this spring?
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I will work with the Minister responsible for seniors, as well as who's also the Minister responsible for Health and Social Services, to look at options for such an event, and get back to the member, and also work with the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All question Kittiwake County, the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as you noted, it is National Flag Day, and so it's only befitting that I talk about immigration. Our country is obviously a great one, and arguably our territory is one of the greatest things about it. And so I appreciate the effort that the government is making as it relates to attracting immigrants here to the north. My questions are for the Minister of ITI, and I would like to start to ask the Minister, as mentioned in my member statement, ITI's business stream for attracting immigration doesn't appear to have been that successful over the past few years. Can the Minister maybe advise us if the department's latest numbers indicate any improvement in recruiting immigration to the business stream? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The latest numbers that I got in front of me here, in fact I have them right here, and I'll read them out so everyone can hear them. Arrived in the N.W.T for operating businesses, we had 4 applicants for a total investment of $1.2 million. Signed a BPA and awaiting arrival in N.W.T is 10 applicants for $3.9 million. Submitted application for the Northwest Territories nominee programs, staffing analysis, 1 for $300,000, and received an invitation to apply, and staff awaiting applicants is 7 for $2.3 million. So a total of 22 with a total investment of almost $8 million. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, la Kidder Cassie member, Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and those are, I suppose, maybe good statistics to hear. Can the Minister maybe indicate to us if the department feels that they're meeting their intentions with regard to attracting immigrants into the business stream? I appreciate getting the statistics, but you know, is it, are those numbers what we are trying to achieve, or are we behind, or are we ahead of our goals? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, if we go by based on the number that's always thrown around, attracting 2,000 immigrants to the Northwest Territories, if you put ECE's file and mine together, we are nowhere near the 2,000 number. We are working diligently to try to improve that. Myself and the department have had conversations about how we can approach the business stream of things and how we can maybe change things up to attract more people in the Northwest Territories. The department is working very hard on this initiative by launching a new website, working to streamline the process and make it simpler and these sorts of things. But I think one of the conversations that has taken place that I can update members is with myself and the department, we're looking at maybe, you know, the challenges the federal government takes so long to approve some of these applicants, and that's a hindrance to the whole process, is to maybe we start looking at attracting immigrants with inside the country. Newly arrived immigrants that's moved to Canada and maybe want to maybe relocate and look at moving somewhere else, or business opportunities and that sort of matter. So that's one of the things that the department and I have talked about. One of the other things we're talking about, and we want to sit down with is the 3 diamond mines and see if there's an opportunity there with the people that are flying in and outside of our territory, which we would prefer them to be living here. But is there a group of immigrants that we can attract from outside of the country that could potentially relocate and move to the Northwest Territories to work in these mines? So these are the kinds of conversations that are taking place, and we want to try to increase the numbers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Kidder Cassie member, Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the Minister providing a fulsome answer, and it seems as though he is having some genuine conversations and putting considerable effort into this important area, which is applauded by me, quite frankly. We have seen success in the past as it relates to attracting immigrants here. The Minister will recall that the secondary diamond industry brought a number of folks here, Armenians in particular, and so it's those kinds of efforts that I would like to see us undertake in the future. But specifically to the business stream, you heard me speak earlier today about other jurisdictions making some changes to attract people. British Columbia is, the initial investment has to be $200,000 to have an immigrant come in and invest in small business. Ours is $300,000 for the city of Yellowknife. Is there any kind of consideration being given to that investment that can help attract immigrants more to the north? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's a conversation that I have not had with the department, if the fee is a hindrance to people moving here, and I will take that up with the department and get back to the member if that's a possibility of having a look at that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nunde member Yellowknife North.
Speaker, I appreciate that. That's a critical factor. I mean, obviously, how much somebody has to take out of their savings to invest in a new country where they're not familiar with the rules and the policies, it's a big risk. And so, recognizing that we're also competing with other jurisdictions, I think if we can give that some serious consideration, then it'll be to our benefit. I'm wondering if the minister has taken the opportunity to reach out to others in terms of industry and small business. He mentioned the diamond mines, but are there others that the minister and the department are reaching out to learn from where it is that we need additional capacity, where we need new skill sets, where we need new investment? I gave the example of the secondary diamond industry. Are there other opportunities we could exploit? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, those are two exactly what that I've raised. It's funny that he's mentioned the second diamond area industry. As we all know, that Almont Diamonds has purchased the one site out on Airport Road there, and the issue they're having right now around getting that up and running is through Immigration Canada and how long it takes, and I'm referring back to that. As far as other industries and stuff, I have not talked to anyone else about, is there an opportunity to do this? The business side of it is for new investment dollars for businesses in the Northwest Territories. I get the member's point around if we're not being cost competitive with a sister territory like our province like BC, if they're at 200,000 and we're at 350,000, that takes us out of the market. This is a high cost of the country doing business, and we'll have to have a serious look at that. So I'm open to any kind of input from all members or residents of Northwest Territories how we can increase the numbers of business stream. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Hikada Cannon, the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My questions are for the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment, who also has responsibility for oil and gas. I spoke of the developer's decision to not proceed with the Mackenzie Gas project in December 2017. N.W.T ended its financial contributions to the Aboriginal Pipeline Group in 2017-18. I'd like to know from the Minister, what, if any, support does our government continue to provide for the Aboriginal Pipeline Group now, and are new contributions or support being planned? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member's right. Last year was our last time we supported them, but moving through this business cycle, we have no plans on providing funding to APG. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nakita Cassie, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to thank the Minister for his response on the last question. One of the mandate commitments that Cabinet pushed was to develop a long-term strategy to attract investment in oil and gas. The mandate tracking webpage shows that this item was completed in late 2016, but it still hasn't seen the light of day. Companies are voting with their feet and wallets and leaving. Where is the long-term strategy, and why would we continue to attract or try to attract investment when industry has no interest? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our territory has considerable petroleum potential, and we have committed in our mandate to deliver a long-term strategy and capitalize on these reserves. With that said, though, this isn't an isolated initiative. It directly links to the important work we're doing as a government in the Northwest Territories. We have the energy strategy, the climate change strategic framework, and we're moving all three pieces of these initiatives together. And this is a shared vision that we have to work towards the new energy climate change strategic framework going forward, and the initiatives that we've signed on to. And we're looking at publicizing these three documents hopefully in April. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadadaya Cassie, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the Minister for letting us know that the this oil and gas strategy is supposed to be made available in April. But clearly, there's no interest in exploration in the offshore, and now onshore oil and gas, as shown by the demise of the Mackenzie Gas Project and the decision by Husky to not frack any further in the SAW-2. The Premier predicted the end of oil and gas, and even Matthews Energy Consulting says we need to shift our oil and gas focus from exploration to remediation. Will the Minister start to refocus our efforts on oil and gas to remediation and small-scale development that could provide local energy rather than the mega project approach? Must see, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we bring our strategy forward and table it in the House here shortly, it recognizes that we have to address the needs of climate change. That is the first priority of this government, but also we got to take in the current political environment around what we consider moving this forward with around the knowledge economy as such, and what advantages does it ensure residents of the N.W.T. I can reassure the member for sure in the strategy when we table it, there's going to be a focus on using local energy for local use. That is one of them. But we still have to have a long-term strategy going forward, how to develop our resources. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, non délégué, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, and that's welcome news from the Minister. I look forward to the strategy. Lastly, in my member's statement, I spoke about lessons learned from the Mackenzie Gas Project, about putting all of our eggs in the non-renewable resource mega project basket. We learned about trying to cut corners on project assessment that eventually sort of comes back to bite you. But perhaps the biggest lesson is the need to move past oil and gas to diversify our economy. So I'd like to know from the Minister, what lessons has he learned from the demise of the Mackenzie Gas Project? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, you can answer this a number of ways, and I'm going to answer it the way I want to answer it. First of all, the demise of the Mackenzie Gas Project was due to the current market prices at the day. It went from $11 down to $1.90. So market prices dictated that thing shut down. But at the same time, I think some of the lessons learned, and the Premier's talked about this a number of times when we're traveling around, is the Aboriginal Pipeline Group, how good that was, and it was the heart and strength of this initiative. And it is a landmark partnership that when we're out there speaking to the public and traveling around and doing FPTs, it's a model that for future development, not just in our territory, but the country could take as an approach to how they can move some of these big, large initiatives forward. But the other side of it, too, is the environmental process, how long it's taken. 7 years to get this initiative through is way too long. I'm glad to see the federal government come out with their new legislative proposals or initiatives coming forward with the environmental regulations. It's going to be a 2-year process max on some of these initiatives, and that's going to bring some of these projects forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions. You can add Canada, member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the second part of my member statement briefly talked about accessing traditional dengue treatment or medicine, and there seems to be some confusion on how they can access that, and when I was talking to the elders in Fort Liard. So my question is for the Minister of Health and Social Services. Mr. Speaker, presently, is my understanding, medical travel only covers travel to the N.W.T borders when they are accessing traditional dengue treatments. Can the Minister of Health and Social Services please confirm what the process is and how it's done? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, medical travel doesn't actually cover travel for individuals who wish to attend traditional dengue-type healing in the Northwest Territories or even outside of the Northwest Territories. However, the federal NIHB program may actually cover some of the transportation costs for individuals to access traditional healer services, but that must be pre-authorized by Health Canada, First Nations, and Inuit Health Branch. So they need to apply through NIHB. It isn't something that is currently covered through GNWT or medical travel. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Canada, Cassie, member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that's really great information to understand and hear. Will the Minister be willing to get that information or show us where we can get this information so we can share it with the residents of the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Yeah, absolutely, certainly. And as a note, we do administer NIHB on behalf of the federal government. We don't make program decisions. We don't make funding level decisions, but we do administer. And I do know that staff are happy to help individuals fill out applications if they're interested in pursuing this type of opportunities, either in the north or in the south. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Tada Daya Kasi Member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. I guess I'm just looking for, is there some information packages that he can share with us so that we can share with our constituents? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the information on the NIHB, the non-insured health benefits, is online. It is available. I'm happy to sit down with the member and find out exactly what he's looking for as far as content and figure out how best we can flow that information through MLAs on both sides of this House so that our residents who are interested can certainly apply for support through NIHB. But as I indicated, they still have to get prior approval, so we can help figure out that process for residents as well.
Oral question. Nunda Daya Kasi Member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will work with the Minister and sit down and talk to him about it and try to get some more information for the constituents, and maybe we'll be able to share with other members who are interested. So I thank the Minister for that commitment. Has the department, Mr. Speaker, has the department looked at bringing Denny healers up from down south to help residents, especially elders, when it's regarding their concern for their health? And I'll just leave that with that question there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to working with the member to help get some of that information out. There are unfortunately some limitations. I understand that NIHB will only cover individuals as far as like provincial boundaries or borders, which is actually, I think, goes to the member's second question. In the Northwest Territories, we want to support traditional healing and wellness. We want to do things differently. And up to now, there really has been nothing done to support traditional health or wellness in the Northwest Territories. We're trying to change that right now. We want to have more options for residents, and I think it's really important to recognize all the incredible partners out there who are doing work. The Arctic Indigenous Wellness Foundation is doing really important work to bring traditional wellness and healing to the Northwest Territories. We're working with them by making space available on the Stanton campus so that they can move forward with the wellness compound, wellness complex. We also are working with a group, I believe, in Fort Good Hope to test some models of some traditional healing opportunities in the SAW2. The Stanton Hospital is getting ready to pilot an elders and residents program to bring more traditional healing and wellness. We have put together terms of reference in partnership with Indigenous governments from across the Northwest Territories to form a wellness advisory group to provide advice and guidance to us on how we can better incorporate traditional healing and wellness into our system as a whole, so people don't even have to look outside to programs or services in the South, that we can truly be an integrated system here that incorporates both traditional as well as Western medicine to provide holistic care for all residents of the Northwest Territories.
Merci. Oral question, Ikadaya Cannon, the member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's been a lot of concerns raised by Indigenous activists about the integrity of procedural fairness in our justice system. I'd like to ask the Minister of Justice if he has taken any steps to review these concerns and how they apply to our role in the Canadian justice system. Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can't, of course, and it would be improper for me to discuss any specific case before the courts, but there has been a good deal of commentary about the jury system across Canada. I can advise that I have been thinking about this issue and would like to hear from the public and also from members of the local bar who practice in this area. I'm a little concerned that radical changes to the jury system would be ill-advised. This system has served us well for 1,000 years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nakita Dayakasi, member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do have some familiarity with the jury system as the former jury administrator for this government. Is the minister, and I'm pleased to hear the minister is considering opening this discussion up to the public. Is this just an idea he's having, or is he planning on launching some sort of public consultation on the issues that have been raised around fairness in our justice system? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, I wasn't thinking of having a public consultation. I, too, have a good deal of experience with the jury system and have found that it has worked very well in our jurisdiction, dealing with many jury trials in my home community of Fort Smith and also in other, at least one or two other communities. I certainly will be, I often meet with members of my profession and would like to hear from them. Certainly if the public wishes to write me or contact me in some way, I'd also be interested in hearing their concerns, but I'm not planning any formal public process at this time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadade, Cassie Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate this is a sensitive issue, but it's also an important issue, and people need to be heard. And I might be asking the wrong minister, but if the minister could talk to the Minister of Public Engagement and perhaps consult with that minister to develop a consultation, a roundtable discussion, anything really. It doesn't have to be terribly expensive, but can the minister commit to having some sort of public engagement around these issues and the broader issue of reconciliation in the Northwest Territories and Canada? Thank you.
Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, of course, the legislation, the criminal legislation, is a federal concern, and I think that it would be more appropriate for the federal minister to be addressed in this area. The member also alluded to the broader area of reconciliation, and members will know that the government of the Northwest Territories is dedicated to that concept of reconciliation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere, Cassie Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just because it's a federal issue doesn't mean we don't have a responsibility to raise these issues that are being raised by our constituents and by people who are leading rallies and protests outside this building to get our attention. So will the minister commit to bringing this to the federal Minister of Justice or to the FTP table and see if there can be a national conversation around, or see if the N.W.T can join the national conversation and if you can find a way to do this without delay. Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I imagine this matter will be discussed at the next FPT, so should it be on the agenda, certainly we will be involved with that discussion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Hikara Cannon, the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to continue my conversation that I had yesterday with the Minister of Lands on mine site reclamation. And yesterday he committed, or he said that he was sure that N.W.T had not given any kind of a release or indemnity to TerraX with regard to work that they may want to carry out at the Ptarmigan mine site. So I'm wondering if the minister would be willing to check with his federal counterparts about whether the federal government had issued any kind of indemnity or release to TerraX with regard to their work on the Ptarmigan mine site. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for this question, but must take the question as notice.
Question has been taken as noticed. Oral questions. Oral questions. Written questions. Member for Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Infrastructure regarding the Government of the Northwest Territories sole source contracts report for the period April 1st to December 31st, 2017. They ask for a rationale for contracting on a sole source basis for specific goods and services. Could the Minister please provide, with respect to sole source, number 2865 for $7,200,000, and sole source number 2922 for $14,800,000 with Imperial Oil Limited for the supply of petroleum products. An explanation why this purchase was necessary through sole source and not through public tender. Number 2, with respect to sole source 2949 for $200,000 with the N.W.T Development Corporation for as and when financial advisory services. An explanation of the specific scope of these services and why they are not sourced in-house from N.W.T advisors. Number 3, with respect to sole source 3559 for $10,130,000 with Offshore Recruiting Services Incorporated for Marine Transportation Services, an explanation of what is meant by offshore recruiting services. And number 4, with respect to sole source 2811 for $8,555 with Fireside Project Management Incorporated for a Stanton Territorial Hospital Renewal Project Manager, an explanation of why this function was not fulfilled with N.W.T in-house resources or by the Boreal Health Partnership. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Written questions. Written questions. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to seek unanimous consent to go to item number 5 in the order of the day. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member seeking unanimous consent to return to item number 5 on orders of the day. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleagues for allowing us to come back to it. I'd like to welcome a long-time friend, Stephen Cooper, to the Assembly. Stephen is the lead counsel for the Labrador Resident School claim and currently counsel for the 60 Scoop class and most recently the Indian Hospital Case Act, as well as I'd like to recognize Andrew Geisterfer. I apologize if I hurt your name on that way, but who is in the process to become a member of the Law Society of the N.W.T and Nunavut, and this is his first trip to Yellowknife. Welcome.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize my constituent, Ms. Kelly Martin. Thank you.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. It's been a busy week, and I forgot earlier to mention that there's a page from my constituency serving in the Assembly, so I'd like to recognize and thank Sarah Cassaway for her work and all the work of the pages during this very busy budget session. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Returns to written question. Madam Clerk.
Speaker, I have a return to written question 4-18-3 asked by the member for Yellowknife Centre on February 7th, 2018 to the Minister of Finance regarding New Stanton Hospital funding arrangements. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Returns to written questions. Return to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to budget address, day 6 of 7. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is the third budget of the 18th Legislative Assembly and the third time that members have gone through the painstaking process of reviewing the draft budget and providing detailed input to the Minister of Finance and his cabinet colleagues. I have to say, I'm beginning to wonder why we bother. Before I comment on the 2018-19 budget, let me say a few words to those of you who might be listening about the role of regular members in the business planning process. I think it is important to explain this process to members of the public. Although this government talks a lot about transparency, the business planning process remains shrouded in secrecy. I will come back to the topic of secrecy later, but for now, let me set out the process and the role regular members play in the budget cycle. From our perspective, the important stage of the budget planning process are the development of the government's fiscal strategy, the development and review of the business plans, the budget address, and the presentation and review of the main estimates in the Legislative Assembly. The G&W.T's business planning process occurs on an annual cycle. It all starts with the development of the government's fiscal strategy. This strategy is established by the finance minister in consultation with his cabinet colleagues. It is developed by considering the G&W.T's projected financial position based on a set of assumptions about revenues, expenditures, and federal transfer payments, and by considering parameters such as the government's federally set borrowing authority and its own fiscal responsibility policy. The government comes to some decision about how much of a surplus it wants to carry, how much debt it can responsibly manage, and how to meet those objectives by balancing revenues with expenses. Once established, it is used by the Financial Management Board to set budget targets for each department. Regular members have some impact in shaping the fiscal strategy, but because it is ultimately the government strategy, we must often resort to political pressure to effect any meaningful change. 2 years ago, at the beginning of this Assembly, the G&W.T started out with a fiscal strategy based on deep budgetary cuts, to the tune of $150 million in the first year alone. The regular members objected strongly to this approach, which, as anyone could see, was clearly based on drastic austerity measures, even though the finance minister said it wasn't. Regular members were not convinced that deep budget cuts were realistic or necessary, and we were concerned about their impact on our fragile northern economy, already destabilized by low commodity prices and flat population growth. We were told, however, by the Honourable Minister of Finance, that 2 years of belt tightening would be followed by 2 years of greater spending. The cynic in me could not help but notice this freer spending would conveniently occur in the lead-up to the next election. Regular members advocated instead for a more balanced approach. In fact, we brought forward a motion in the House to have the $150 million reduction target removed from the government's mandate. Although this motion was carried, the target was, nonetheless, still touted in the Finance Minister's 2016 budget address, and it continues to reverberate in this year's budget. In considering the context for business planning, it is important to note that the budget we are now considering is the G&W.T's operating budget. There's a separate process for reviewing the government's capital infrastructure budget, but the two are inexorably linked by the government's fiscal responsibility policy. This policy requires the government to fund at least 50% of its capital infrastructure investments from operating budget surpluses generated by government departments alone, excluding the boards, agencies, and crown corporations that, for accounting purposes, make up the larger government reporting entity. What all this means is that if the government is going to afford the big-ticket infrastructure projects it wants to undertake, it must do so by reducing spending on vital programs and services. And we are not talking about modest capital infrastructure spending. According to this government's 2018-19 capital estimates, the money allocated and spent on infrastructure from April 1st, 2016 to March 31st, 2019 totals $998,765,000. That's almost $1 billion in capital spending over 3 years, of which 50% was or will be financed by this government through reduced spending and cuts to healthcare, education, and social development. Mr. Speaker, now we have this fiscal environment in mind. It sets the context which the government's current business plans were developed and reviewed by the standing committees over an intensive 3-week period in November 2017. There are 4 standing committees that work collaboratively to complete this review. The 3 envelope committees, the Standing Committee on Government Operations, the Standing Committee on Social Development, and the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment. They all share the work of reviewing the business plans of the G&W.T's 10 departments and the N.W.T. Housing Corporation. The committees make recommendations for changes to the business plans that are forwarded to the individual departments through the Minister of Finance. The role of the Standing Committee on Priorities and Planning, which is composed of all regular members, is to review and prioritize these recommendations coming from the envelope committees that have a dollar impact on the budget, to make additional recommendations as needed, and to ensure that nothing has been overlooked. It is a significant undertaking for the standing committees and their staff to carry out this work. In fact, we estimate that about 1,300 person-hours were spent on the business plan review alone. The 3 envelope committees made a combined total of 142 recommendations and requests for further information, all with a view to improving the 2018-19 budget and the overall operations of this government. In that regard, I should note that not all these recommendations are related to the financial aspects of the budget. Many have to do with improving how information is presented and how government organizes and prioritizes its work. The Standing Committee on Social Development made 62 recommendations, including a safe house pilot project for women and children fleeing family violence in communities without shelters, and a request to the Department of Education, Culture and Employment to reverse all proposed reductions to the Social Work Diploma program and the Teacher Education program, and restore regular enrollment and program operations. The Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment made 42 recommendations, including ensuring adequate funding in industry, tourism and investments budget for the Business Development and Investment Corporation and for the Boreal Caribou Monitoring Program, and urging the Department of Environment and Natural Resources to make more substantive progress on the climate change strategic framework. The Standing Committee on Government Operations, the committee for which I serve as chair, made 38 recommendations, including requests that support for the Non-Governmental Organizations Stabilization Fund administered by Municipal and Community Affairs be increased, that the N.W.T support the establishment of more single-window service centers staffed by government service officers, and that the ministers responsible for specialized portfolios be included in the business plan review and be available to answer the Standing Committee's questions, an important step in the committee's view towards greater accountability by this government. Overall, the Standing Committee on Priorities and Planning, often referred to as P&P, made 39 recommendations and requests for information, some of which echoed the recommendations coming from the envelope committees. Some of these recommendations came in the form of opposition to proposed budget cuts and new funding to proposals by the government, including opposition to a proposed reduction of $475,000 to ECE's budget that would have been used for school counselors, proposed reduction of $150,000 to ENR's Boreal Caribou Monitoring Program, a proposed reduction of $925,000 to ITI's budget for the Business Development and Investment Corporation, a proposed reduction to MACA's multi-sport games funding of $650,000 over 3 years, with the first cut being $250,000 in 2018-19, and finally the proposed addition of $387,000 to fund the GNWT's office in Ottawa. Additionally, P&P sought new funding for under-resourced programming, including a $500,000 increase to support the N.W.T Arts Council, a $100,000 touring artist grant program, and $300,000 to establish single-window service centers staffed by government service officers in 2 smaller communities and in Yellowknife. Mr. Speaker, having conducted a thorough review resulting in detailed, cogent recommendations from the standing committees, regular members broke for our holidays, secure in the knowledge that we had done our jobs and confident that our hard work to improve this budget would be accepted by our cabinet colleagues. Alas, Mr. Speaker, our confidence was clearly misplaced, as we learned when the Standing Committee had the opportunity to confidentially review the draft main estimates in January. These are the same draft main estimates that were tabled in the House after the Finance Minister delivered his budget address last week. Mr. Speaker, the regular members look eagerly to the main estimates to see if the labor we put into reviewing the business plans has borne fruit. What did we find there? Well, contrary to the advice of the standing committees, we found a reduction of $475,000 to ECE's budget that would have been used for school counselors, a reduction of $150,000 to ENR's Boreal Caribou Monitoring Program, a reduction of $925,000 to ITI's budget for the BDIC, a $250,000 reduction to MACA's multi-sport games funding, and the addition of $387,000 to fund the GNWT's office in Ottawa. And what do we fail to find, Mr. Speaker? We fail to find the requested $500,000 increase to support for the N.W.T Arts Council, $100,000 for a new touring artist grant program, $150,000 for an additional funding for the NGO Stabilization Fund, or $300,000 to establish 3 new single-window service centers, all of which were recommended by the standing committees. Mr. Speaker, I cannot begin to tell you how frustrating it is for members on this side of the House to see such a poor response to our recommendations. Not a single one of the Standing Committee's recommendations with financial implications was included in the draft main estimates. Not one. The requests made by the Standing Committee totaled somewhere in the vicinity of $2.9 million out of a total budget in excess of $1.7 billion. These were not unreasonable or exorbitant requests. They total less than 0.2% of the budget. Our requests were modest in their amount, consistent with this government's mandate, and important to our constituents. With a mere $2.9 million to enhance program spending, as compared with the same year capital budget estimated at $237 million, the Cabinet couldn't meet us part way. In fact, I have to wonder if they even bothered to review the Standing Committee's input at all before printing the draft estimates. You know, Mr. Speaker, it's been said that the leader sets the tone for the whole organization. When our Premier made his pitch to the Assembly, he considered for the office of the Honourable Premier for a historic second term, he said something that resonated with a lot of newly elected members. He said, and I quote, "During this election it was clear to me that people were tired of adversarial politics and what was perceived as petty infighting. The Northwest Territories residents deserve a government that is focused on making good public policy, not scoring political points. I believe all of us here share that view, and I'm committed to working with regular members to establish a new, more cooperative approach." End quote. Let me ask you this, Mr. Speaker. Do you think a reasonable person would consider Cabinet's response to our budget requests indicative of a cooperative approach? I think not. Rather than cooperation, rather than good public policy, this Cabinet chose to force the hand of regular members, and this is what necessitated the deferral of the budgets of the Department of Executive and Indigenous Affairs and the Department of Education, Culture and Employment earlier this week, to give the members time to negotiate with Cabinet behind the scenes to get a better deal on this budget. I'm encouraged at this point in time that these discussions will result in some concessions in the part of Cabinet, but I want to remind the Premier of the commitment he made to every single one of the members in this House to do business in a new, more cooperative way. On that note, Mr. Speaker, I want to return to the subject of budget secrecy. There's a tradition of secrecy surrounding the development of budgets in Westminster-style parliaments. John Fraser, Speaker of the House of Commons, explained this tradition in a 1987 parliamentary debate. He said, quote, "Budgetary secrecy is a matter of parliamentary convention. Its purpose is to prevent anybody from gaining a private advantage by reason of obtaining advance budgetary information." End quote. It was also touched upon in a 1976 budget address by the Liberal Minister of Finance, Donald MacDonald, who noted that, quote, "The tradition of budget secrecy has two grounds. It is intended to deny anyone financial advantage from advance information, and is intended to ensure that important statements of the government economic policy are disclosed first to members of the House of Commons." At that time, Minister MacDonald suggested that, quote, "The time had come to consider whether some of the long-standing traditions that surround the budgetary process should be modified to serve better the needs of today." End quote. As true as that may have been for the federal government in 1976, I believe it is even more relevant for the government of the Northwest Territories in 2018. This is a consensus system, Mr. Speaker, built in traditions of respect, cooperation, and the sharing of information, principles that seem antithetical to the notion of secrecy. Also, as important as the N.W.T's budget is to the people of the Northwest Territories, openness about proposed budget measures is unlikely to result in disruption to currency or stock markets or anyone else gaining tax advantages. In fact, budget secrecy is in some ways an anachronism, inherited from the British parliamentary system that is out of step with today's technologically fast-paced world. It inhibits consultation, it's contradictory to transparency, and, as it has been said, does not take into account the broad economic and social role which modern budgets must play. I believe it is time for this Assembly to consider the role of budget secrecy in our proceedings and to move to a more transparent and open process, so the people of the Northwest Territories can see exactly what work their MLAs and cabinet ministers are doing for them. That would be consistent with the more cooperative approach that the Premier promised us at the start of this Assembly. There are some things about this budget that trouble me. You've heard those. The budget is irresponsibly silent on the carbon tax and cannabis revenues and how these stack up against the cost of administering the new sales system. The Government of Canada expects revenues of $400 million and costs of $700 million. Surely the situation is similar here in the Northwest Territories. This shows the N.W.T still doesn't have a real plan to deal with cannabis or carbon. I am concerned about the slow pace of legislative progress by this government, Mr. Speaker. I am concerned that it has left too much work to be done in the last 2 years, which will force standing committees to rush through their review of bills, as we have already been asked to do on the cannabis legislation. I'm troubled by the fact we have yet to see legislation to establish an Office of the Ombudsman, legislation that the N.W.T promised in its mandate to introduce in the first 2 years of the Assembly. However, I want to close on a positive note by pointing out that there are things in this budget I am glad to see, such as new funding for friendship centres, additional resources for the settlement of lands, resources, and self-government agreements, and increased investment in benefits to seniors, elders, and the working poor, and the continued support for mining, exploration, and investment. And most importantly, that there are no new tax increases being proposed. I'm also hopeful that before this week is out, Cabinet and regular members will come to an agreement on some of the outstanding matters arising from the Standing Committee's recommendations. I'm glad Cabinet is waking up to the need to develop our economy and make strategic investments to create jobs and growth. Regular members have been making these points for the last 2 years. As we review the individual departments' budgets in Committee of the Whole, I will have more specific, detailed comments on the budget in the days to come. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Replies to budget address day 6 of 7. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to speak in reply to the Minister of Finance budget address from last Thursday. Over the past 2 years, my replies have been somewhat critical of the Minister's budgets. This year, I'm pleased to say that, in general, the budget address gives me some optimism that we're heading in the right direction. But before we get too excited, let me say that it's also apparent that we still have plenty of work to do. Earlier in the 18th Assembly, we confronted what I called a doomsday scenario, where Cabinet was convinced that austerity measures with massive cuts and job reductions were needed to save us from the poorhouse. Mr. Speaker, it was creativity and compromise that got us past that approach, not entirely unscathed, but with a happier outlook and a belief that positive change in the direction of our mandate was possible. Now, today, we are moving forward, but I'm still feeling some reluctance toward taking truly bold steps. Bold steps are exactly what's required to move us ahead with some of our serious challenges. So I want to take us back to principles-first approach, rather than the purse-first approach. Mr. Speaker, a society is not measured wholly by its GDP, by the latest oil prices, or by the rate in which innovation thrives. It's simply, quite frankly, a society is measured by its people. Mr. Speaker, it's measured by how our families are doing, how children and youth are doing in school, how is our health and well-being in our communities. Sadly, on many fronts, we continue to show that we are struggling as a society when measured by these means. The N.W.T continues to have some of the highest rates of incarceration in this country. Our unemployment rates in the community still remain a constant concern. Many students are still not at the grade levels and graduation rates that we would expect in this day and age, and too many people continue to suffer from challenges surrounding mental health and addictions. Mr. Speaker, the reason I raise these points is because the cost-benefit analysis of our investments, no matter if they are in infrastructure or programs and services, at the end of the day, they must show benefits to our children, our families, our elders, and our communities. How we are doing as a people, how well are our people doing is the measure that matters most, and that's the bottom line. Mr. Speaker, there's one area that we will have to face investment significantly in over the coming years, whether we care to or not. We simply don't have a choice. The most important challenge facing us, in fact the world, is climate change. Across the globe, it is affecting employment, health, migration, food security, world ecosystems, and world population. And we're feeling it first and most drastically here in the North. I believe the government recognizes the drastic nature of this challenge, and I commend the government for that acknowledgement by signing on to the Pan-Canadian Framework for Clean Growth and Climate Change. The $1.2 million allocated for climate change resilience and adaptation is important and very much welcomed. That said, only a few people in the public service and few resources are specifically assigned to the climate change file, Mr. Speaker. That's troubling, because this critical global issue deserves much stronger resolve and much faster action than we have seen so far. I'm hopeful that our climate change framework will outline an aggressive approach to tackling this global challenge and that the government arms our departments with adequate resources to take on this daunting task. Mr. Speaker, we know that mining is indeed the backbone of the economy. We have what the world needs in minerals and metals that will help sustain life on this earth. I say that with all seriousness. The world continues to move faster and faster into the realm of innovation and technology. The advancement of developing countries is at an all-time high. Our resources will be sought to support those advancements. The government recognizes the importance of this, and support for developing our own mineral exploration and development regime is important to attracting investment. I commend the government for moving forward with the Mineral Resources Act. To the same end, I do not take our environment lightly. We can look into any corner of our territory and see multiple scars with regard to contamination and past abuse of our lands and waters. But from those experiences, we have become much better at protecting our environment, and we are working with Indigenous governments, various regulatory bodies, and industry to put ourselves at the forefront of protecting our precious ecosystems. And it is with that proven ability to protect our environment that we must know when to apply common sense toward our regulatory requirements for exploration. Regulations should match the degree of impact. Exploration need not be treated with the same regulations as an operating mine. Let's promote exploration while applying appropriate measures to protect our environment. Still on the resources front, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, all indicators for the future of oil development in the north have signified that this prospect is bleak. But there are areas of potential that aren't mentioned. Since oil is on its last years in the Sawtooth, in particular Norman Wells, there will be a major need for rehabilitation in that region. That opportunity could be a years-long project with a similar spending impact as that rehabilitation of Giant Mine. There will be opportunities for generational employment. We must be ready to accept the challenge, preserve the land, and reap the rewards. Similarly, rather than bemoaning that Beaufort oil is stranded in the Northern Sea, we should be seeking ways to exploit inland gas for the benefit of our own communities in that region. Using our own local resources to get off trucked fuels, lower our carbon footprint, and provide cheaper energy only makes sense. Mr. Speaker, the South Slave region was once a thriving hub for agriculture in the N.W.T. and fed many communities with fresh food up and down the valley. I believe we can get there once again, not only in the South Slave, but throughout the entire territory. I appreciate that funding for the agricultural strategy was included in the Minister's address. Access to land is an important step, but it should be emphasized that not only must land be made available, it must also be made affordable if we are to see this sector truly grow and flourish. But I was somewhat discouraged to see limited mention of other economic areas that deserve the government's active and deliberate support. A truly diversified economy will have to include increased support for creative arts industry. Our outdated art strategy needs work to become modernized with the times. Let's make the commitment to engage our creative communities and seek to update the art strategy. Support for developing centers of excellence and knowledge economy will be critical so we can take advantage of our creativity and the talents of our people and create made-in-the-North innovation and technologies. We must remain strong on support for our traditional land and water-based activities that enhance and celebrate our vibrant Indigenous cultures. Other diversification opportunities will require that we be flexible and responsive to changing times and take full advantage of new prospects, such as when cannabis is legalized later this year. People, businesses, and communities will be frustrated if only a few get to capitalize from this opportunity. We must waste no time in distributing the wealth when it comes to these newfound profits. Tourism. This is perhaps the brightest light in our economic horizon, and it deserves our continued investment. In support of tourism, we need to ensure that there is no gap in provision of visitor services in Yellowknife. It's also high time that we fast-track changes to the CTV Act to allow municipalities to implement a hotel levy so they can develop their own destination marketing organizations and enjoy the gains that come from this thriving industry. Mr. Speaker, another priority for fast-tracking is our land rights negotiations. While the Premier was able to offer an optimistic report on the progress of land rights negotiations last year, we haven't heard anything new recently. I commend the $1 million in funding that the government has set aside for this high priority, but we must commit to progress. Mr. Speaker, I don't need to emphasize, as I have before, that a vast majority of our other mandate priorities hinge on the certainty that will be created by the resolution of land rights. There was so much hope at the beginning of the Assembly that land management would be a priority, but regrettably, land use plans are also taking far too long. The Yellowknife Periphery Recreational Land Use Plan was to be completed in the second year of the Assembly, but it is still not done. Other important land use plans seem equally hung up. As one example, how do we promote agricultural development when land use and allocation remain undefined and unclear? I have long supported our three major roadway projects, the Mackenzie Valley Highway, the Y.E.L.L.K.N.I.F. All-Season Road, and the road into the Slave Geological Province. I support our road projects not only because they will help us develop our resource potential, but because they will lower the cost of living and create long-term generational opportunities for employment and small business. This is essential in so many ways to our small communities. Another major contributor to the cost of living is the high cost of power across this territory. Power is not easy, Mr. Speaker, and we face more challenges than almost anywhere. But we need to continue to explore alternatives. Hydro is important to develop, and connecting to the southern grid is a strong long-term option. But it's only one option. Let's not put all our energy eggs in one basket. We have had success in developments of wind power at Diavik and solar power in Colville Lake. The City of Yellowknife's district heating initiative will soon be paying off. Biomass silos have quickly become a common sight in many communities. Even electric cars can now be utilized in the north, and we should be providing charging stations along the highway. All of these areas have potential and need to be emphasized and supported. I want to see an energy strategy that significantly reduces our reliance on fossil fuels, commits us to protecting the environment, and most importantly, lowers the cost of living for Northerners. Mr. Speaker, we followed the lead of our electorate and entered the 18th Assembly with a commitment to creating a government of openness and transparency. I applaud the government for the steps it has taken. Public hearings, better communication with the public, cabinet meetings in the regions, and more recently, the Minister of Finance commitment to a public overview of the budget process. These are all important steps forward, and many in my riding have appreciated the steps that have been taken. But again, Mr. Speaker, there's more we should be doing. Specifically, I would argue that the business planning process needs to be open to public participation. As an MLA providing feedback to government, I would appreciate being able to gather valuable, informed input from my constituents. That would allow me to offer more constructive and valuable feedback to this government, improving the planning process overall. It's frustrating, to say the least, when MLAs have been pitched by departments as to what the government intends to do in the coming year, yet we are not at liberty to go out and consult with constituents and get their thoughts and feedback. This is a backward approach, and we need to make new and open, transparent ways to deliberate on the business plans. We also need to improve our practices with regard to bureaucracy and red tape. I know we are hearing encouraging signals from industry, but we still carry the dubious reputation as the most over-regulated jurisdiction in Canada. As we heard from some energy in this chamber yesterday, our procurement policies have earned us an F grade from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. This kind of inefficiency discourages investment from outside and frustrates homegrown entrepreneurship. Let's focus on streamlining services, reviewing our procurement policies, and working towards achieving at least a D grade next year. The speed of legislation to which the 18th Assembly committed itself is very discouraging. I could go on and on here, but simply, where is the long-promised legislation to establish the Office of the Ombudsman? In the name of transparency, get it done already. Mr. Speaker, part of achieving any ambitious mandate must be to build and lead a great team. To that end, we have a strong workforce in our government, comprised of talented, capable public servants. As any management professional will tell you, what people want is the opportunity to do their best work, utilize their talents, and make a contribution. But we but we have been without a collective agreement for over 2 years. To move forward with our team, we must settle our differences without delay and provide certainty and a path forward. Mr. Speaker, there are many positive things in this budget on which I commend this government. The commitment of additional funding to junior kindergarten is important. Inclusive schooling in JK is very important investment in the future, as is the inclusion of mental health support in our schools. Support for long-term and home care, emphasis on dealing with addictions, help for youth in crisis, these are all very important priority areas. I also commend the government in partnership with the City of Yellowknife for committing funding for a sobering centre in Yellowknife. I'll make 2 final points, Mr. Speaker. The first is that we know a carbon tax is in our future. We must not allow a new tax to be a burden on our future. We must ensure that a carbon regime in the Northwest Territories is northern friendly and revenue neutral.
Yes.
Where our residents need to pay more, we must find a way to return it to them. The achievements of this tax must be a cleaner planet, yes, but not a higher cost of living for our people. The second point is that we must be prepared to meet our end of the federal infrastructure investment. $500 million in federal money will be coming to the N.W.T. over the next 10 years. We must not miss out. We must be prepared to match those dollars with our own and see it as a crucial investment in our upcoming generations, for our upcoming generations. Mr. Speaker, it is hard to believe that we are more than halfway through our term. But I still come to work every day with the same optimism I started with. The challenges are daunting, but our achievements are significant. We should not be bound by the limitations of the past, but be inspired by the courage of possibility and the faith placed in us by our constituents to build a better future. Mr. Speaker, I am encouraged by what I heard in the Minister of Finance's address. And notwithstanding that we have considerable debate before us, on the surface, I'm hopeful that in the end, I can get up and support this budget. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Replies to budget address day 6 of 7. Replies to budget address day 6 of 7. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of standing special committee. Reports of standing special committee. Reports on committee on the review of bills. Reports on committee on the review of bills. Tabling of documents. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following 2 documents entitled Follow-Up Letter for Oral Question 50-18(3) Impact of Collapse of Carillion on Stanton Renewable Project, and further to my return to written question 4-18(3), a document entitled Stanton Territorial Hospital Project Cash Flow. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Wednesday, February 21st, 2018, I will move that Bill 5, an act to amend the Summary Conviction Procedures Act, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Motion. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Great Slave, that notwithstanding Rule 4, when this House adjourns on February 15th, 2018, it shall be adjourned until Tuesday, February 20th, 2018. And further, that at any time prior to February 20th, 2018, if the Speaker is satisfied after consultation with the Executive Council and members of the Legislative Assembly, that the public interest requires that the House should meet at an earlier time during the adjournment, the Speaker may give notice, and thereupon the House shall meet at the time stated in such notice and shall transact its business as it has been duly adjourned to that time. Massey.
Massey. Motions in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Massey. Motions. Motions. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration Committee of the Whole Bills and Other Matters. Minister Statement 1-18 bracket 3. Minister Statement 19-18 bracket 3. Table Document 63-18 bracket 3 with Member Satu in the chair.
Calling committee to order. What is the wishes of committee? Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the Chair of Committee of the Whole leave the chair and report progress. Thank you.
So. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Vice Chair. Motion is on the floor to report progress. The motion is in order and is non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. I will rise and report progress. Thank you.
May I have the report, Member Satu?
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering Member Statement 1-18 brackets 3, North Slave Correctional Complex inmate concerns, Member Statement 19-18 brackets 3, Aurora College Foundational Review Process, TD 63-18 brackets 3 main estimates 2018-2019, and would like to report progress. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with. Merci.
Do I have a seconder? Member for Cam Lake. Motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Madam Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Tuesday, February 20th, 2018 at 1:30 p.m. 1, prayer. 2, minister statements. 3, member statements. 4, reports of standing and special committees. 5, returns to oral questions. 6, recognition of visitors in the gallery. 7, acknowledgements. 8, oral questions. 9, written questions. 10, return to written questions. 11, replies to the Commissioner's opening address. 12, replies to budget address, day 7 of 7. 13, petitions. 14, reports of committee on the review of bills. 15, tabling of documents. 16, notices of motion. 17, notices of motion for first reading of bills. 18, motions. 19, first reading of bills. 20, second reading of bills. 21, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters. Minister's Statement 1-18-3, North Slave Correctional Complex inmate concerns. Minister's Statement 19-18-3, Aurora College Foundational Review Process. Table Document 63-18-3, Main Estimates 2018-2019. 22, Report of Committee of the Whole. 23, Third Reading of Bills. 24, Orders of the Day.
This House stands adjourned till Tuesday, February 20th, 2018, 1:30 p.m.
Order!